Hey, welcome back to Reason and Theology, specifically Louis Dizon segment 1P3 here on RNT. And Louis is actually going to be starting a new segment here on the channel for Catholic Bible study streams with the lectionary readings. So that's what we're going to
Yes.
be doing. Louis, welcome back. How are you?
Oh, doing great. It's start of the new year, so doing a lot of new things for 2024. As this is the time of the year when people start getting in shape, and I'm doing something similar to that on the side. But I'm also trying to work my mind, and I'm trying to do both at the same time. Yeah,
Can be a challenge.
yeah,
I get it. I get it.
yeah. Yeah.
But
So fun fact,
mhm.
just before the stream started, I was actually doing my preparation for this segment on a treadmill.
Is that right?
Yeah, so I'm actually burning calories while I'm
While
also
preparing.
making the necessary research for
Yeah.
this segment. So, uh,
Multitasking, that's the way you gotta do it.
yep. Yeah, which means that the blood is still pumping, and hopefully that'll help me to more efficiently crank out my thoughts as we go along this stream.
I love it, I love it. Well, yeah,
Yeah,
take it over wherever you wanna go with it. I'll go ahead and hand it over to you. I'll be here,
sure
but
thing.
you'll be the full one on the screen. By the way, if you want to share the lectionary readings, I'll also add that here.
I actually have a it up here. So
Okay.
Verbum has something called Catholic Daily Readings, which
Mhm,
has the lectionary readings.
mhm.
So if anyone has Verbum, you can use that. If you don't, you can use the UCCB website to follow along. Now, mind you, I use the English Standard Version Catholic Edition. And if you're following along the USCCB, they use the New American Bible Revised Edition. So sometimes you'll see a slight discrepancy between the translation I'm using and the one you'll be reading. But that shouldn't pose too big of an issue. So now, since this is the first time we're doing this, I just want to share a little bit about my vision for what I want to be doing with this segment. So, you'll know that I've been doing a Bible commentary series for the past little while where I'm doing entire books of the Bible, and I've been doing that once a month. So, this is a little different because it's focusing specifically on the missal readings. So it's going to be a little more focused than the Bible commentary series. And also, Lord willing, I want to do this every week. So you might notice, if you look at your calendar, that it is currently Thursday, which means that we are 3 days before the next Sunday. And that's part of my plan for this, which is I want to do this Bible study 2 or 3 days before the Sunday when these readings actually come up. And there's a number of reasons for this relating to who my intended audience is. So, um, well, a lot of us were used to listening to maybe like 12 to 15-minute homily, which skims over the surface of the text. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with a short homily. Sometimes people have short attention spans, and you have to cater to that. But the problem with such a short span of time is you don't really get to plumb the depths of the passage. So, what a lot of priests and deacons like to do in their homilies when they're covering these readings is that they'll go straight to the application part. So they'll find, okay, how does this text apply to our daily lives? And then make that connection immediately. But as any good student of the Bible knows, a proper Bible study goes through 3 steps. First, you make your observations of what the features of the text are: the who, the what, the where, the how. And then you go through interpretation, which is what are the implications of all of that in terms of theology and whatnot. And then you get to the application, which is okay. In light of all that, what does it have to do with my daily life? And within the constraints of a Sunday homily, you can't really say much about the background of the text. So the first 2 parts of that tend to be cut out a bit. And another thing that you will probably notice in a lot of homilies is that there's focus. The main focus is on the gospel reading. So the gospel reading has pride of place among the readings. And this is part of the Catholic Church's teaching that while all of Scripture is inspired and useful, the Gospels are especially important to pay attention to because that's the part of Scripture that tells us directly about the life of Christ. So it makes sense to have a gospel focused homily. But if we're trying to do a Bible study, I would say it's important to give equal focus to all the readings because they reinforce each other. So, one of the things that um, people who pay attention to the readings will inevitably notice is that the other readings serve to reinforce the gospel. So the Old Testament reading always has something in it that is relevant to the gospel reading. It's not necessarily always clear what it is, but if you look closely enough, you'll find what it is. With the epistle reading, it's also a little bit tricky sometimes. What One of the things that I want to do when we do this Bible study is I'm going to show you how all of the readings connect together. Um, thematically. I also want to make this a tool that homilists can use. So, any priests or deacons listening to the stream, this is also for you because I want to make this something that you can use to prepare your own homilies. So, you can use some of the insights that I will share in this reading or in this Bible study, and you can apply it in your own Sunday homilies. Uh, so, with that being said, what we'll do is we'll read straight through the readings and then first, and then we'll double back. We'll start with the first reading, and then we'll go through the psalm, and then the second reading, and then finally the gospel. And then we'll see what we can discern um, from reading those. So let's start with the first reading, which is from Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 to 6. So again, I am reading from the ESV Catholic edition. Feel free to follow along with whatever other translation you're comfortable with. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will rise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around and see. They all gather together. They come to you. Your sons shall come from afar, and your daughters shall be carried on the hip. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you, and the wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praise of the Lord. And now we get to the responsorial psalm. So, because we're not in a liturgy, I'm just going to read it straight through and skip the response. So, Psalm 72 of Solomon. Give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to the royal son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. In his days may the righteous flourish, and peace abound, till the moon be no more. May he have dominion from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. May the kings of Tarshish and the coastlands render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts. May all kings fall down before him, all nations serve him. For he delivers the needy when he calls, the poor and him who has no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy, and saves the lives of the needy. Now we get to the second reading, which is from Ephesians chapter 3, verses 2 to 3 and 5 to 6. Assuming that you have heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me for you, how the mystery was made known to me by revelation, as I have written which was not made known to the sons of men in other generations as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. This mystery is that the Gentiles are fellow heirs, members of the same body, and partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel. And then finally, we get to the gospel reading, Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east come to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judah, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it arose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So now that we have read through the text, let's go double back and see what we can learn from a close reading of this. Starting with our Old Testament reading. So in Isaiah chapter 60, if you remember, if those of you who've watched my Bible commentary on Isaiah, I had a lot to say about that book. In particular, the idea that um, Isaiah may have been written by multiple authors. I am not one of those people who believes that. I believe that Isaiah wrote all of Isaiah. And if you watch the relevant Bible commentary, you'll know why I believe that. And there's one additional reason why I believe all of the book of Isaiah came from the pen of the prophet Isaiah, which I'm going to unpack as I explain this passage. So we're going to start off by looking at verse 1, where it says, arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. There are two words that I want you to pay attention to, which is the word light and the word glory. So both of these words are packed with meaning when they appear in the Hebrew Bible. So let's begin with the word light. So if you recall, in the Genesis account, it says that the first thing that God made on day one was light. In Genesis 1:3, it says, Vayomer Adonai Yehi Or Vahi Or. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. But light doesn't just end with the Genesis account. As a theme, it occurs all throughout the scriptures. And in Isaiah in particular, the concept of light shows up quite a bit in the context of the suffering servant. So remember, there are servant songs in Isaiah. And one particular relevant passage is the servant song that occurs in chapter 49. So I'm just going to quote verses 1 and 6 of this. And I'll skip verses 2 through 5. You can read that on your own. Listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the womb. From the body of my mother, he named my name. So you might notice something interesting about the servant in this passage, which is that he is calling forth the coastlands and the peoples from afar. This is important if we're going to cross-reference chapter 60 with chapter 49, because as you can see, chapter 60 talks about the coming of the nations to Mount Zion. And here, the peoples from afar, i.e., the distant nations, are being called forth. And in verse 6, we read, and sorry, we should probably read verse 6, that's right. He says, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." So there you can see the light motif showing up. So the servant that is being described in Isaiah 49 is called the light for the nations. So in a sense, you can say that when it says that your light has come, that light is in meant to be the light of the nations that is being described in chapter 49. So Isaiah 60 is not explicitly messianic, but it is implicitly messianic, by virtue of the fact that it is picking up that theme from elsewhere in the same book. Now, the other word that I want you to pay attention to is the word glory. So, in the Hebrew Bible, whenever the word glory appears, it's very important to pay attention to, because the glory of the Lord is usually associated with the presence of the Lord. So, one good example of this occurs in Exodus chapter 43, not chapter 43, chapter 40, where God gives instructions to build the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is built exactly according to God's specifications. And then, if you scroll down to verse 34 onwards, so I'm going to read verses 34 to 38. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Notice the repetition of the glory of the Lord. This is when the Bible repeats something, that's the Bible's way of saying, pay attention, this is important. So the Bible mentions twice, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. It's trying to draw your attention to this detail. And then going on, it says, "Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys." So the glory of the Lord is equated with the presence of the Lord, which is represented in the book of Exodus by the cloud of the Lord. And it is mentioned here that whenever the cloud descended, that was the sign that the Lord is in your midst. Now, pay attention to that. That's important. Later on, in the period of the monarchy, they replaced the tabernacle with a temple. So David begins construction, and then Solomon completes it, and then the Ark of the Covenant is brought to the temple. That's in 1 Kings chapter 8. Now, one of the great paradoxes of the Bible is how God can simultaneously be everywhere present and localized in a specific location. You know, in classical theism, we refer to God as omnipresent, so he is everywhere. At the same time, we can say that God is in a specific place that he isn't necessarily in other places. So you see this contrast in chapter 8. So in verse 10, it says, "And when the priest came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord." And then verse 11 says, "So that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord." So you'll notice that once again, the cloud of the Lord is equated with the glory of the Lord, and the glory of the Lord represents the presence of the Lord. Now, it's interesting that later that same passage, King Solomon says the following: But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? So King Solomon is basically saying, yes, God is dwelling in this house, but he is not limited by this house. This is one of the, some less astute minds might say there's a contradiction in this passage. Well, is God in the house or is he not in the house? The answer is he is in the house. He's also everywhere else, but he is in the house in a way that he's not necessarily everywhere else because he has a special presence there. Um, and that's one of the things that is difficult to wrap our minds around, but the Bible proclaims this as a fact. Now, this idea of the glory of the Lord continues. So we get to the book of Isaiah now. Um, in chapter 6, we have this. So we've read this before, and those of you who go to Mass regularly are familiar with this passage because it is this is where we get the Sanctus from. In verse 3, you have this saying by the angels that Isaiah sees in his vision, where it says, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melo Kol Haaretz Kvodo. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. So again, there's that word glory showing up. And when it says the whole earth is full of his glory, keeping in mind what we just read, it means two things simultaneously. One is that the whole earth praises the glory of God. So we know this from Psalm 19, that the heavens declare the glory of God. But the other thing that this says is that God is everywhere. If the glory of the Lord is the presence of the Lord, as we established in the two previous passages, then to say that the whole earth is full of his glory is another way of saying God is throughout the whole earth. And then one last important passage is Malachi. So let me see. Where's the? I'm trying to remember which part of Malachi it was. Ah, yes. So this one is interesting. So in chapter 3, verse 1, it says, Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. So there's, again, this idea of God being found in his temple. Now, the idea of glory is not explicitly mentioned here, but there is that idea of presence there. So in a sense, you can see that the glory of the Lord will come to his temple, but the word glory isn't explicitly mentioned there. So that idea is that God is, in a sense, located spatially, even if he is everywhere present. And that's important when we're considering the incarnation, because what is the incarnation if not the omnipresent God becoming spatially localized, but in the form of a human being? In a sense, Isaiah 60, by combining these themes together, is preparing us for the incarnation, which makes it a perfect reading for the season. Now, going forward with our reading, in verses 2 and 3, it says, For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. So you can start to see where the whole connection with the Magi comes in, because the kings shall come to the light. The light, of course, as you know, it has to do with the star, which we'll talk about when we get to the gospel reading. So let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. So you have this contrast between darkness and light, because, whenever there's mention of light in the Bible, darkness is usually mentioned in conjunction with it. And this occurs in a few other places in Scripture. For example, Isaiah chapter 9. In verse 2, it says, The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. So throughout the book of Isaiah is this idea of darkness being overcome by the light. You also see this in the Gospel of John, where it says, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And I reference Isaiah chapter 9 because it is another one of those important messianic prophecies. Because in verse 6 it says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." I have a lengthy discussion of this passage in the Bible commentary on Isaiah, so I refer readers to that. I will not repeat what I said in the previous stream. But you can see how all these themes come together here. Another passage that is very important in connection with this is Isaiah chapter 2, because we can't talk about the nations without talking about this passage. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills. And all the nations shall flow to it, and many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." So notice that the leitmotif comes up once again in verse 5. So um, Isaiah uses these themes, the theme of glory, the theme of light, um, and connects them together magnificently within the book. This is one of the reasons why I believe the book of Isaiah is a unified composition. This is why I don't buy the theory that two or three different authors wrote it several centuries apart. To me, just reading the text, there is so much unity within that one book. And it holds so well together that I can't imagine three different people weaving such a magnificently crafted work. And the other thing to note is how well the book, as it is written, bookends so well with each other. So you've got chapter 2, close to the beginning of the book, talking about how the nations shall see the light of the Lord. And you get to close to the end of the book, not quite the end, but close to it, in chapter 60. And what does it talk about? The nations coming to see the light of the Lord. So, in a way, the book of Isaiah bookends itself with this kind of connection that appears on both ends of it. And to me, if you posit that the book was the composition of three different people, that kind of ruins the whole book ending of Isaiah. To me, it makes more sense that the prophet, the son of Amos, wrote all of this. But enough about that. I want to look at some of the themes that appear here. So the mountain of the house of the Lord shows up in verse 2. So you'll notice that the house of the Lord and the presence of the Lord and the glory of the Lord and the light of the Lord are all connected together. So it's very hard to separate these themes. They usually appear in clusters. And that's because in the Old Testament Jewish mindset, the glory of the Lord is most clearly visible in his temple, in his holy house, which is why Isaiah has this vision that Mount Zion is the place that the nations shall go to in order to learn the law of the Lord, in order to see the light of the Lord. Now, you'll also notice that the word of the Lord is mentioned here. So in the New Testament, all of this becomes Christological. So it says the word of the Lord comes out of Zion. So what is the word of the Lord? Well, in the Jewish mindset, it is the Torah. In fact, this couplet makes it explicit. Out of Zion shall go forth in Hebrew the Torah and the word of Adonai from Jerusalem. Whenever a Hebrew parallelism takes place like that, it's telling you that these two are meant to be synonyms with each other. But from a New Testament perspective, word has much more connotations than just that, because in the prologue of John, you have those themes of the word of the Lord that existed from all eternity. In the beginning was the word, and the word of was God. Word was with God, and the word was God. You know what else the prologue of John says? That word is the light of the Lord. So in verses 4 or 5, it says, In him was life, and this life was the light of men, and the light shines in darkness, and darkness has not overcome it. And then, of course, the verse that we most readily recognize because we recite it in the Angelus is verse 14. And the word became flesh and dwelt among us. So the word makes its presence felt in the form of a human being. And guess what the second half of that verse says? And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So St. John does the same thing that Isaiah does. He combines those themes of the word, the glory, the light, and the presence, all in one motif, and it's all fulfilled in Jesus. As for Zion, I would like to refer readers to Hebrews chapter 12. So, a lot of people who come from a dispensational perspective, so dispensationalism is this evangelical school of thought that emerged in the 19th century that posits that Israel, ethnic Israel, still has a place in God's plan. They say that, well, we have to take these terms literally. So, when God says Mount Zion is important to him, he really means that geographical location in the Holy Land. But if you read the Old Testament in Live and New, you get a different perspective. Because in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22, it says, But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering. So what Hebrews is telling us is that, yes, in a sense, this passage is fulfilled, but it's not fulfilled in the sense that the physical, geographical location of Mount Zion is where we turn to, but rather the heavenly Jerusalem. So um, we're supposed to look for this. And of course, St. Paul in Galatians also speaks about the Jerusalem above. So, in a sense, the church is that heavenly Jerusalem. And by becoming part of the church, we become part of the Zion that is typologically alluded to in the book of Isaiah. Now, I want to read verses 4 to 6 in conjunction because this is the passage that really connects um, our Old Testament reading with the gospel reading. So, lift up your eyes all around and see. They all gather together. They come to you. Your sons shall come from afar, and your daughters shall be carried on the hip. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and exult, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you, and the wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah, and all those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. So I want to focus specifically on verse 6 in this case. So you'll notice a few locations mentioned here. You've got Midian, and you got Ephah, and then Sheba. Actually, Ephah is not a place name, it's a personal name. So for some background, let's go to Genesis chapter 25. So it says here that after Abraham died, he took another wife named Keturah. And out of Keturah, Abraham had a son, and that son's name was Midian. So it says in verse 2, she bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Of all those names, Midian is the only one that really becomes prominent after this. And in verse 4, it says the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanoch, Abida, and Eldah. So Midian and Ephah are the two main characters that we want to pay attention to here. Now, where does Midian end up later on? So the Midianites show up in many different places throughout the Hebrew Bible. Now, they were primarily concentrated in what is known as Northwest Arabia. So, if you recall in the book of Exodus, when Moses flees Egypt, he goes to the land of Midian and he meets Jethro, marries his daughter, all that good stuff. So, a lot of biblical scholars believe that the land Moses went to was actually in northwestern Arabia. So, this is a region of the world that later came to be known as Nabatea. In modern geography, this is the border between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. So when it talks about Midian and Sheba, it's talking about, sorry, Midian and Ephah, it's talking about that part of the world. Now, where is Sheba? So there are two basic candidates for Sheba. One is it's in Ethiopia, and the others it's in Yemen. I'll spare you the details, but of the vast majority of biblical scholars I have consulted on this believe that Sheba is the more likely candidate. So when King Solomon is visited by the Queen of Sheba, sorry to all the Ethiopians listening to the chat, but I don't think the Queen of Sheba is from your country. I think that the Queen of Sheba most likely came from Yemen. And that makes sense if you consider the gifts that she brought with her, because Yemen is well known for its frankincense. That is one of their main exports during ancient times. And as for gold, it has been said that Nabatea was a well known um, exporter or importer of gold, as well as one other important thing, myrrh. During ancient times. So Nabatean traders would go down the African coast, get gold and myrrh from the land of Punt, which is identified as the Horn of Africa, modern day Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. And then they would bring it back to Nabatea and they would trade it to the rest of the ancient Near East. And this actually gets us into one of those long-standing scholarly debates, which is where exactly did the Magi come from? If you listen to a lot of um, popular expositions of the Epiphany account, you'll hear that the Magi probably came from Chaldea or Persia. To this day, if you look at a lot of commentaries, they will say that that is the most likely place where they came from. Interestingly, there is a smaller minority opinion that posits that the wise men actually came from Arabia. So, according to this minority opinion, if you cross reference Isaiah 60 with Matthew 2, it implies that the wise men actually, in fact, came from the lands that were mentioned here: Midian, Ephah, and Sheba. And where are they located? Well, Midian is in Nabatea, northwest Arabia. Sheba is in Yemen, southwest Arabia. What are the gifts they bring with them? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Where are those most abundant? Arabia. Now, that doesn't preclude the possibility that um, those goods could have been acquired from Persia as well, but it mixes so much better with the Isaiah passage. And in fact, there is uh, this one journal article from the Bibliotheca Sacra, October 1999, by Tony T. Maaluf. His the title of the article is "Were the Magi from Persia or Arabia?" And I won't quote the whole thing. You can look up the article for yourselves. It's on the internet. But Maaluf actually comes to the conclusion that, well, actually, it is most likely that the Magi came from Arabia. Um, so, the all of the details of the story suggest an Arabian origin of the Magi rather than a Babylonian or a Persian one. Now, some people have wondered, well, if that's the case, why are they called Magi? Aren't the Magi Persian astrologers or Chaldean astrologers? Well, yes, but also remember that during the Achaemenid dynasty, 5 centuries before Christ, The Persians basically conquered the entire ancient Near East, and what they ended up doing was exporting elements of their culture and religion throughout the region. So it's quite plausible that the Magi spread out from Chaldea to Arabia, and some of the Arabians embraced the Magian religion. Uh, so, what you have in this case would be Arabian astrologer kings who were influenced by Chaldean slash Persian religion, bringing the riches of their own land to Bethlehem, which we'll get into more detail when we get to the gospel account. We still have to cover the psalm and the epistle along the way, so we'll get to that next. So, Psalm 72. Um, Psalms. This responsorial psalm is probably the most underrated part of the liturgy of the word because, yes, we sing it, but we almost pay no attention to it. When was the last time you heard a homilist actually give any attention to the responsorial psalm? Which is a shame because a lot of the truths found in the other readings are conveyed here in a much more poetic format. So, Psalm 72 is one of the Solomonic Psalms. So most of the Psalms are attributed to David. They begin with that superscription, Le David. Psalm 72 begins by saying, Li Shlomo, of Solomon. This could mean that Solomon himself penned it, or perhaps it could mean that an anonymous scribe in Solomon's court wrote it in his honor, either of which is possible. I'm not here to resolve that debate either way, and it's not particularly important. But I want to note that a lot of the same themes from Isaiah 60 are in Psalm 72. So this is a royal accession psalm. So, and that's relevant because what is the incarnation if not the accession of the royal son of David to his rightful throne? And it says, may he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. So the reigning of the new king always comes with it a desire that he will reign with justice and righteousness, which makes sense in of the connection with Isaiah 9, which we um, quoted earlier, as well as Isaiah 49. Also, Mary's Magnificat. If you remember, one of the things that the Blessed Virgin prays or sings is that the coming of the Messiah will also herald justice for the poor and the downtrodden. So, in a way, what this psalm proclaims, may he judge your poor with righteousness and your judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice, is fulfilled in the coming of the Messiah. And then it's verse 7, it says, in his days may the righteous flourish and peace abound till the moon be no more. And it says, may have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. As a Canadian, this one is my favorite verse in the whole psalm because we adopted it as our national motto. But notice something. This passage is saying that the Messianic kingdom does not have limitations of time or space. Till the moon be no more. In other words, till the end of time may the Messianic king reign. To the ends of the earth it has to do with the fact that it's not just the Holy Land that he will rule over, but the entire world. So just by reading the psalm, you can tell that there's something much greater than the kingdom of Israel in view in this passage, because the kingdom of Israel came to an end and it never ruled over the ends of the earth. But the kingdom of God shall reign forever, and it does extend throughout all the ends of the earth. And then in verse 10, it says, may the kings of Tarshish and of the coastlands render him tribute. So Tarshish, scholars differ over one another over the exact location, but a lot of people seem to think that it is in Spain. In any case, what seems to be in view when Tarshish is mentioned is the westernmost part of the known world at that time. So connect that with all the reference to the easterly regions, so Persia, Arabia, etc. So the idea is that the kingdom of God extends from as far west as you can go to as far east as you could go. And the coastlands, of course, render him tribute, which is again another reference, which is of course another hyperlink to Isaiah 49. Of course, Psalm 72 came first, so it's possible that Isaiah is referencing Psalm 72 when he wrote about the coastlands. But in this case, you can see how the themes connect. And it says, "May all kingdoms fall down before him, all nations serve him." So, again, the idea of the kings and the nations of the world coming is connected to this king, this royal king. Um, Always watch out for these motifs that keep recurring. And then finally, verses 12 and 13. "For he delivers the needy when he calls, the poor and him who has no helper. He has pity on the weak and the needy and saves the lives of the needy." So you've got bookends in this psalm. The beginning, it says, um, justice and righteousness for the poor and downtrodden. And that's the same thing that the responsorial psalm ends with. And now we get to the epistle reading. So, once again, one of the things that you always want to pay attention to when you're reading the epistle is, well, how does this connect to all the other readings? With the epistle, it tends to be trickier. The uh, the joining motif is a little less obvious, but if you've been paying attention up to this point, you should have clued into what it is. And the key verse actually appears at the very end of this. So in verse 6, this mystery is that the Gentiles are fellow heirs, members of the same body, and partakers of promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel. So the motif here is that the Gentiles, the nations who did not previously know the law, now have the revelation of God. They have been enlightened by him. Now, notice in the preceding verses, it says that this was a mystery that was made known to Paul by revelation. So God made known this to him, this. It was not made known to the sons of men other generations, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. So I want you to understand this correctly. It's not saying that this is completely new and it's completely unprecedented, because you have already seen how in some of the passages that we've read in the Old Testament that there are hints that the nations, the Gentiles, the Goyim will become part of God's family as well. We see that in Isaiah 2. We see that in Isaiah 49. We see that hinted as well in Isaiah 60. Even Psalm 72, by mentioning the kings and nations, hints at it. But it's all in types and shadows. It talks about these nations receiving the light of the Lord. It talks about them worshiping the one true God. But it doesn't explicitly say that they become heirs of God's promises. Because as far as the Israelites are concerned, that belongs to them. That is their inheritance. These other nations, they just get scraps that fall off the table. But St. Paul here in Ephesians is saying that is not the case. In fact, the Gentiles are just as much heirs to God's promises as the Jews. And this became clear when you get to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when we get to the Magi, that is exactly what we see. Because the Magi aren't just these random kings or wise men or both who come out of nowhere to pay homage to some distant king. In fact, they are there as the first non-Jewish witnesses to the coming of the Lord. So in a sense, we all place ourselves in the position of the Magi as those who were previously not part of God's covenant, but have been grafted in, to use the language of Romans 11. And now, let's get to the Gospel of Matthew. Um, so there's a lot of tangents that we can go through here. So I'm going to try to keep it focused, but that'll be a little bit difficult because there's so much to unpack here. A lot of our nativity scenes and nativity shows simply do not do justice to the gospel narrative because there's so much here to unpack. The first thing we need to get out of the way is what is the place of the Epiphany account in the larger Christmas narrative? Because if you look at a lot of the nativity scenes, you have this image of, oh, Jesus is born, and then the wise men, no, and then the shepherds come shortly after he is born, and then the wise men come right behind them. But if you read the Gospels carefully, it's a little bit more complicated than that because there is a time lapse that occurs in the middle. So let's pull up the narrative as it's found in the Gospel of Luke and compare the two with each other. So I'm not going to quote the whole Lucan narrative, just the relevant parts. So we begin with how they ended up in Bethlehem, because in Matthew it says, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. Well, hold on just a second. How did he even get there? Well, Matthew just starts off with Bethlehem. Luke tells us that it starts off in Nazareth and then they went to Bethlehem. Skeptics say this is a contradiction, which is not the case. Matthew never says that they were, the Holy Family was originally from Bethlehem. He simply starts off the story there. But be that as it may, you have, the census, and then you have Joseph going there, and then Mary gives birth in a manger, and they had no room in the kataluma. So this is one of my minor quibbles with a lot of major English translations. It says there is no room in the inn. So if you look here, the ESDC has a little footnote that says, or guest room. For some reason, they never put guest room as the main word in the text because we're so used to hearing the word inn. But almost every Greek scholar will tell you that the Greek word there is not the word for inn. So let's pull up the Greek here. So you've got the word kataluma or katalima. And that word shows up one other place in the Gospels, and that is in the Last Supper narrative. In verse 11, it says, so in chapter Luke 22:11 says, and tell the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room? What is the word for guest room in Greek? Katalima. So we can surmise from the use of the same word in Luke 22:11 and Luke 2 that it's not an inn in view here, but a guest room. And this is important because if you look at the Matthew narrative, where do the wise men find baby Jesus and the Holy Family? Not in a stable, not in a cave, but in a house. And this is because it's not that they relocated in between the Lucan account and the Matthew account, although they may have gotten better quarters in between. But the kataluma in Luke 2:7 is actually the guest room of an extended family house. Remember, Joseph is from Bethlehem originally, which means that the reason why they placed him in a manger was because the extended family house was full. There's a whole bunch of articles explaining this in more detail, so I won't belabor the point. But notice that later on in the Gospel of Luke, in verse 21, it says that at the end of 8 days, Jesus was circumcised, and that was when he got his name. So we know that they were 8 days in, the wise men hadn't arrived yet. And then 40 days in, you have the presentation of Jesus in the temple. This is the fourth joyful mystery of the Rosary. And it's also what we celebrate during Candlemas, which is February 2nd. So there is a 40-day time lapse in between when Jesus was born and when he was presented in the temple. What we learn from this is that the wise men could not have arrived in Bethlehem before, uh, less than 40 days after Jesus was born, because immediately after the Magi arrive, the Holy Family flees to Jerusalem. Sorry, flees to Egypt, and they couldn't have gone to Jerusalem after the Magi arrived because Herod was already after them. Which means, based on the chronology of Matthew and Luke combined together, we can surmise that the Magi appeared no less than 40 days after Jesus was born, which means that your nativity scene, sad to say, is misleading you. Those events did not all happen at once. They happened over a 40-day time span, and it's possible, in fact, quite probable, that the Holy Family got a better room in between because, you know, there's nothing about a manger in the Matthew narrative. Now, let's look at some of the details of this narrative. So, in the days of the Herod the King, so we know a lot about Herod the Great because he is written about a lot in Josephus's Antiquities. In fact, um, Josephus, a large chunk of the second half of the Antiquities talks about him, and he was not well liked among the Jews because, first of all, he wasn't a Jew himself. He was an Edomite or an Idumean. What happened was during the Maccabean period, the Hasmonean Jews annexed Edom, forcibly converted all the Edomites to Judaism, and since then, Edom, or Idumea as it became known in Latin, became a client province of Israel. And what happened during the Roman occupation was that an Idumean had been installed as the puppet king of Judea. That is King Herod. Herod, of course, was a little bit paranoid. He got increasingly paranoid as time went on. He reportedly killed his favorite wife and two of his own sons because he was afraid that they were plotting against him. So, one of the things that skeptics like to argue um, against the gospel is that, oh, the none of the extra biblical accounts mention anything about about Herod killing all of the infants in Bethlehem. Well, maybe not, but there's a lot of things Josephus doesn't mention. And what we do know about Herod from what Josephus does mention fits in with what we see in Matthew. Both Matthew and Josephus give us this picture of a paranoid king who is willing to kill anyone and everyone in order to secure his own rule. So if he hears that there is this new king on the block, he is not going to be happy about that. Speaking of Josephus, there's a very interesting parallel between Jesus and Moses that emerges once you start reading about some of the expansions to the Exodus narrative that occurs in Josephus. So we often talk about Jesus being the new Moses or Moses being a type of Christ. And that's certainly true. And we see it in the Bible. But not a lot of people know this, but you can better appreciate the connection between the two if you know what the Jews during Jesus' time believed about Moses, because there's a bunch of extra details in rabbinic Judaism that aren't in the Bible, but they are present in Josephus' Antiquities. You also see them in much more detail in Midrash Rabbah, which is several centuries after Christ. We'll stick to Josephus because it's contemporaneous with the Gospels. So one of the interesting things that occurs in Josephus that you won't find in Exodus is that a certain unnamed seer or prophet predicted the coming of Moses. So in Antiquities, Book 4, paragraph 205, it says this: while the affairs of the Hebrews were in this condition, there was this occasion offered itself to the Egyptians, which made them more solicitous for the extinction of our nation. One of those sacred scribes, who were very sagacious in foretelling future events, truly told the king that about this time there would a child be born to the Israelites who, if he were reared, would bring the Egyptian dominion low and would raise the Israelites, that he would excel all men in virtue and obtain a glory that would be remembered through all ages. And then it goes on to say, which thing was so feared by the king that, according to this man's opinion, he commanded that they should cast every male child which was born to the Israelites into the river and destroy it. That besides this, the Egyptian midwives should watch the labors of the Hebrew women and observe what is born. It's slightly different from what you see in Exodus, because in Exodus it mentions that the reason why Pharaoh ordered the Hebrew baby boys killed was because they're growing too numerous. It says so in yeah, in chapter 1 verses 15 onwards. Um, we won't read the whole text, but here Josephus supplies an additional reason, which is that Pharaoh heard a prophecy of a child to be born who would challenge his rule. Sound familiar? Now, later on, it says in paragraph 209, but no one can be too hard for the purpose of God, though he contrived 10,000 subtle devices for that end. For this child whom the sacred scribe foretold was brought up and concealed from the observers appointed by the king, and he that foretold him did not mistake in the consequence of his preservation, which were brought to pass after man and following. And then it talks about Amram and Jochebed and how they gave, and then they begat Moses. Interestingly, there's another detail here that's not in Exodus. In paragraph 212 of Antiquities, it says, accordingly, God had mercy on him and was moved by his supplication. He stood by him in his sleep and exhorted him not to despair of his future favorites. So, according to Josephus, God appears to Amram in a dream in order to let him know that the child to be born, which was foretold, which the Pharaoh would seek to put to death, would be safeguarded. Sound familiar? And then in paragraph 215, this is the Lord speaking to Amram. Know therefore that I shall provide for you all in common what is for your good, and particularly for thyself what shall make thee famous. For that child, out of dread of whose nativity the Egyptians have doomed the Israelite children to destruction, shall be this child of thine, and shall be concealed from those who watch to destroy him. Now, one last paragraph, paragraph 217. When the vision had informed him of these things, Amram awaked and told it to Jochebed, who was his wife. And now the fear increased upon them on account of the prediction in Amram's dream, for they were under concern not only for the child, but on account of the great happiness that was to come to him also. So, not a lot of people realize this, but there are very tight parallels between the story of Moses as it is expanded upon in Josephus and the story of Jesus as it is recounted in Matthew. Now, we know Matthew didn't copy Josephus because Matthew wrote first by about a decade or two, depending on which chronology you accept. But we know Josephus couldn't have copied Matthew either, because at this point in time, Christianity was just a minor sect, and none of the authorities cared much about them. They certainly weren't worthy of copying. So what is most likely the case here is that this rabbinic expansion to the Exodus narrative was being orally circulated among the Israelites during Jesus' time, which was later written of by Josephus. Matthew was probably aware of it. He may have seen providentially in these oral retellings echoes of the Nativity and decided to write his own nativity narrative in such a way that these parallels with what was known about Moses would become apparent. So there is, so if you know the Jewish background behind Matthew, you can appreciate all these details so much better. Now, let's read a little bit more. So in verse 2, we read that the Magi come to um, King Herod and they say, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it arose and have come to worship him." So there is this idea of worship here. It comes up again in verse 11, where it says, "And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary's mother, and they fell down, worshipped him." So I used to use this as proof for the divinity of Christ, the idea that Jesus is worshipped. Now, I do believe Jesus is God. I do believe Jesus is worshipped as God, but I no longer believe that the Epiphany narrative is one of those instances. And let me explain why. So, the relevant word here is proskuneo. So you can see in the Greek here, um, it says, "Edomen harav tuton astera entia natolike, ilthomen proskinise avto." So proskinise, that's the infinitive form of proskuneo. If you look at some other translations, it's going to be do homage. So if I switch from the ESV to the NRSV, which is the main translation we use in the Canadian lectionary. It says, "For we have observed his start, his rising, and have come to pay him homage." So there's a bit of a translation difference there. In the New American Bible, same thing. We saw his start, its rising, and come to do him homage. So what is proskuneo exactly? Now, this is where I get a little bit detailed when it comes to lexical semantics. I'll try to keep it short, but proskuneo has a bunch of different connotations. So it could mean worship of divinity. It could mean homage given to a political ruler, or it could mean giving, someone giving a coming to someone with a request and bowing down as a way to make that request. Now, when it comes to this particular instance of proskuneo, remember that the idea here is that they're looking for a king. So they're looking for the newborn king. They didn't say, "Where is God incarnate?" Um, the Magi don't necessarily show an awareness of that particular nuance of the incarnation or the idea of an incarnation to begin with. What they show awareness of is that there is a king being foretold about here. Um, and their gifts are consistent with that. These are the sort of gifts that you would give to a king. Now, elsewhere in the Gospels, the word proskuneo is used in a context where it does mean king, but you have to look at it from the context. Matthew chapter 2 is not clearly one of those. You might still be able to argue it, but a lot of commentators believe that proskuneo in this context just means homage given to a king. So one of the commentaries that I used to prepare for this is the Expositor's Bible Commentary, edited by Tremper Longman and others. So it's an evangelical Protestant commentary, one of the better ones, I would say. And they say here, let me quote it to you: "Worship need not imply that the Magi recognize Jesus' divinity. It may simply mean do homage. Their own statement suggests homage paid royalty rather than the worship of deity. But Matthew, having already told of the virginal conception, doubtless expected his readers to discern something more, namely that the Magi worshipped better than they knew." So, in other words, the Magi were paying homage to God incarnate. They just weren't cognizant of it at the time. In their view, the one they are worshiping or giving homage to may have been an exalted king, but he's still a human being. Um, the idea that this is God incarnate is something that only becomes apparent later on, um, in hindsight. Now, it says that after the Magi came, um, the chief priests and the scribes mention that all of this fulfills a prophecy in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, since from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. Now, one of the complicating things regarding this particular quote is that it doesn't exactly line up with how the Old Testament puts it. So, in Micah 5:2, and this is the case whether you read it in the Masoretic text or the Septuagint. They read the same both in both texts. It says, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth one who is to be ruler of Israel, whose coming is from of old, from ancient days." So notice that the passage is a little bit different. So this is an example of um, Matthew doing a little bit of loose paraphrasing. So remember, when the New Testament authors quote from the Old Testament, they don't necessarily quote verbatim. They will usually paraphrase. They might change a word or two, but in such a way that the um, gist of the text is preserved. They might even combine two prophecies together. So in this case, the second half of this is actually from a different passage. So in the Expositor's Bible commentary, it actually mentions that there is an echo here of 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 2. So in 2 Samuel 5:2, it says, "In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led us and brought us in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So Matthew is also, in a way, invoking this passage alongside Micah when he quotes this. Interestingly, there are some salient details in Micah 5:2 that are not quoted by Matthew, but also give us insight into the nature of the Messiah. So, first of all, Bethlehem Ephratah, which is different from Bethlehem, land of Judah. What is Ephratah exactly? To answer that, we need to go to the book of Ruth. Now, in here, in the verse 2 verses, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his two sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of the two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephratites from Bethlehem in Judah." So Ephratah is a clan name. And it says here that Naomi and Elimelech were Ephratites. Why is this important? Well, at the end of the book of Ruth, we learn that they had a relative named Boaz who married a Moabite named Ruth, and they had a son named Obed who was the grandfather of David. So David is from the clan of Ephratah. And of course, the Messiah is the son of David. So by saying Bethlehem Ephratah, Micah is saying that the Messiah comes from this town and from this clan. Now, also, there's this one little interesting statement that Matthew leaves out, which is he says regarding the Messiah, his coming is from old, from ancient days. Why is that important? Well, in Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, "As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire." So the Ancient of Days is a title of the Lord, of Yahweh. But it's saying here that the Messiah comes from ancient days. What does that mean? It means the ruler prophesied in Micah 5:2 is none other than Yahweh come in the flesh. So Micah 5:2 properly interpreted is a hint to the divinity of Christ. But you have to do this cross-referencing to pick that up. So we're going to skip a few other details here. So in verse 10, it's verses 9 and 10, it says the star guided them to Bethlehem. So star is very prominent because remember, what is the motif that we saw in all the Old Testament passages? The motif of light. Well, how does that light manifest itself in the Epiphany narrative? In the form of a star. Now, what exactly is the star? Again, if you look at the Expositor's Bible Dictionary, Expositor's Bible Commentary, there's a number of theories about the nature of the star in question. And none of them command any real consensus. So some people think it was a supernova. Some people think it was a conjunction of planets. Some people think it was an angel. Some people think that it was a supernaturally produced star that appeared just for the occasion. And all of these theories have their adherents, but none of them are airtight. So I'm not going to defend any one of them except to point out that there are different theories. To quote the Expositor's Bible Commentary, the evidence is insufficient to come down firmly on one particular astronomical theory. So we should not wrap ourselves up into pretzels trying to figure out what the star exactly is. Anywho, let's go forward. So they prostrated themselves. They opened their treasures of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So there's a lot of allegorical interpretation of the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The most common one that you'll see in a lot of Catholic interpretation is that this represents the three offices of Christ. He is the priest, prophet, and king. Okay, so gold befits his kingship because, kings deck themselves out with gold and represents their riches. Frankincense represents priestly authority because frankincense is what they use to offer incense to God in the tabernacle and in the temple. And myrrh has to do with Christ as a prophet. I'm not sure what that has to do with Christ being a prophet, but you know what does, why that is a good reference though, because myrrh is mentioned elsewhere. So in both Mark 15:23 and John 19:39, it mentions myrrh in them. They're both connected to passion narrative, but in slightly different ways. So in Mark 15:23, it says they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. So it's kind of weird because if you think about it, myrrh is a preservative. It's almost like trying giving someone wine mixed with formaldehyde. That's not gonna make them any better. That's just gonna preserve their insides before they even die. And then John 19:39 says, Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. So myrrh is a preservative. It's used to, keep the body from stinking. It's also used to slow down the decomposition process. So Jesus is buried with a bunch of myrrh in order to keep his body from deteriorating. Of course, it didn't deteriorate because he, resurrected. That's another story. But so in a way, the reference to gold, frankincense, and myrrh is supposed to foretell for us what Jesus's ministry is going to be like. He is going to be a king. He's going to offer a sacrifice for God, and he's going to be sacrificed himself for our sins. Now, of course, the Magi weren't necessarily cognizant of all this. Um, God, in His providence, um, helps us to connect the dots. But the Magi presented these gifts because, of course, they came to pay homage to a king. So they're going to give the best gifts that a king can get. And while this isn't explicitly mentioned in the text, this is something more that I've heard priests mention in their homilies. It said that when they fled to Egypt, they brought the gold, frankincense, and myrrh with them, and they used it to make a living for themselves during the 3 years they were away. So that actually leads us to a couple more things that I want to unpack. Actually, one last thing that I want to unpack. There were a few other details that I wanted to go through. I don't think they're terribly important to bring up, so I will leave them out. But one thing I want to mention is this whole business with King Herod and how that ties into the chronology of these events. Because, okay, so we know that Herod died, that the Holy Family fled to Egypt until Herod died. And when Herod died, they returned to Nazareth. Now, when did King Herod die exactly? That would have been, depending on who you ask, it was either 4 BC or 1 BC. Majority opinion, it happened in 1 BC. Sorry, 4 BC rather. So there's a whole discussion of King Herod's timeline somewhere here. Um, okay. So yeah, I'm heavily dependent on the expositor's Bible commentary for all the details here. But you can consult other commentaries that'll give you similar details. But so the majority opinion is that Herod died 4 BC. If Herod died 4 BC, that means Jesus could not have been born earlier than 4 BC. Now, we know for a fact that Jesus, um, actually, let me rephrase that. So there's also a minority opinion that says he actually died in 1 BC. So Ernest Martin wrote a book called The Birth of Christ Recalculated, where he argues that it's 1 BC. Needless to say, this one hasn't caught on very much. Majority still believe that it was 4 BC. Um, and if this is true, that would place Christ's birth either around early, so either late 5 BC or early 4 BC, if we take the 4 BC date. If Herod died 1 BC, he would have been born late 2 BC. Um, and when we connect this to the Gospel of Luke, we start to see how the chronology plays out. Because in Luke chapter 3, it says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, now this was the beginning of Christ's ministry. There are two interpretations of what Luke is saying here, again, using the Expositor's Bible Dictionary. It could mean that it could mean from the occasion of his predecessor's death, which would have been AD 14, in which case the 15th year would have been AD 28 to 29. Alternatively, according to another method, Tiberius' 15th year would have been from the fall of AD 27 to the fall of AD 28. This is important when we're considering when did Jesus die, how old was Jesus when he died, um, and what year it was. So actually, those are all the same question, really. But if you look at a lot of commentaries, there's two dates that have been proposed as a date for Jesus' death. It would have been either AD 30 or AD 33, and those are the only two possibilities because Jesus died on the 14th of Nisan in the Hebrew calendar, um, and the only two years where that date would have fell on the Sabbath, would have been AD 30 and AD 33. Now, if we connect that to the date of Herod's death, if Jesus was born in 4 BC and began his ministry in 27 BC and had a 3-year ministry, he would have died in AD 30. Remember, there's this long-standing tradition that Jesus was 33 years old when he died. This is how we calculate that. The other possibility is we take the minority opinion that Herod died in 1 BC, which meant that the fifth, and then we connect that to the 15th year being AD 29. That's when Jesus began his public ministry, and he would have died in AD 33 to conclude the 3-year public ministry. And in that case, he also would have been 33 years old. Another possibility is that Herod died in 4 BC. Jesus began his public ministry AD 29, and he was crucified AD 33. Now, the one little hiccup in that theory is it goes against the long-standing tradition that Jesus was 33 years old when he died, because if you do the math, Jesus would have been 36 years old when he died in that chronology. But those are the 3 possible ways that you tally up all of the texts. Now, one final thing that I want to mention. So, you know, I try to stay away from homiletics here because I'm more concerned about the details of the text, and then I'll leave it to the homilist to figure out the application. But the 2 themes that I want you to take away when you're reading these texts together is, 1, the glory of the Lord and the light of the Lord come in the person of Jesus Christ, who is God incarnate. All the readings connect together to show that this is the unifying theme. The other important thing to note is that with the coming of Christ, all the nations become heirs of God's promises. So the Magi arrive, and they represent the coming of the Gentiles to know the Lord. And we, who are mostly Gentiles, I know there might be a few Jews listening to this chat, but most of us here are Gentiles, and we are the heirs of the Magi in being those who are outside of the covenant people but have been grafted in. The Magi were the first Gentiles to become believers in the Messiah, and we follow after them. So that is it with the introductory episode of the Bible study stream. Wow, we went through an hour and a half. For those of you who are used to 15 to 20-minute homilies, going through the missal readings for an hour and a half is a lot. But as you can see, there's definitely a lot to unpack there, and I hope you all enjoyed that.
Thank you so much for that, Lewis. Looking forward to the next one. So we're going to be doing this weekly, right?
Yep, that's right. So I didn't actually know how long it would take for me to do all this. I thought I could be done in an hour, but I guess there's a lot more detail than I expected. But
No,
I'll
that's okay. This is great stuff. People are really enjoying it. So
yeah.
looking forward to more of these, and put in a plug for anything you want to make the audience aware of.
All right. So I do write weekly missile reflections. So it's going to be linked to in the notes below, Lord willing. So if you want like a shorter, more bite-sized reflection on the texts, I recommend people check that out. Also, we're setting up a Patreon specifically for 1 Peter 3. It's not up yet, but once it is, we're going to also add it to the show description.
Yeah, absolutely. That should be ready for next week's show. So y'all stay tuned for that. Everybody hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you appreciated it and enjoyed this Bible study, hit that like button and also leave a comment letting us know what you thought about the video. All right, that's going to do it, y'all. See you later.